My name is Rebecca Slayton. I am the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. I want to start today with a brief land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homeland of Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today. We welcome Reid Pauly, who is an assistant professor of political science at Brown University and the Dean's Assistant Professor of Nuclear Security and Policy at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He studies nuclear proliferation and nuclear strategy, coercion, and secrecy in international politics. He's also an alum of the government department here at Cornell. So welcome back.
Thank you so much. What I'm sharing today is a forthcoming book argument. It's with our very own Cornell University Press, coming out in summer 2025. And it sounds to me, listening to the discussion that you were just having, that you've read the article version, which just came out in International Security. It's based on a dissertation I wrote at MIT. My Ph.D. is from the MIT Security Studies program. That even is based on questions that I was exposed to and big questions about international politics that people were asking on this campus when I was here all that time ago. So let's dive in. What am I focused on? A big question. I think it's a big question and a big puzzle about international politics. Why do some coercive demands succeed while others fail? Coercion is a strategy one states go to quite often, or more often than I think than sometimes we care to admit about international politics. It's quite a coercive place. Governments make threats, often of the use of military or economic punishment against each other. And they're doing so to try and change the behavior of someone else. Okay, so threats to change behavior. They do this over all kinds of stakes to curtail human rights abuses. They can be vile or virtuous stakes, right? I want you to do something that we might think of as a good thing. I want you to do something that we might think of as actually fundamentally against your interests. Communicating resolve to try and get you to change borders in my favor. I'm trying to secure better terms in a trade agreement that we're negotiating, or as I said, curtail human rights abuses, whatnot. I'm going to talk a lot today about, stopping nuclear weapons programs. So, when states make threats, regardless of whether they should be making those threats, whether that's good policy, I want to know whether they work and why. In some sense, the puzzle is best expressed by an observation of just an aggregate empirical pattern, which is that this doesn't work very often. When states compel, coercion works about a third of the time. And by success, I mean that targets of these threats concede to the demand that the coercer has made of them. They change their behavior in line with the demand that's been made. That happens about 1/3 of the time. But it's also evident the puzzle in terms of whose threats succeed. Coercers who are stronger, measured in Todd Sexter's work by those who spend more money on their military forces, higher military expenditures, does not lead to some increase in the likelihood of successful military coercion. Stronger countries actually only have a 36% success rate when they coerce. And the United States government success rate is even lower, depending on how you count, what counts as a threat, what counts as concession. Scholars have found rates of like 18, 29, or 31% of the time American threats succeed. So in considering this record of coercion, political scientists like me have some answers for you already to try and explain failures of coercion. First of all, we think it's difficult because there is a selection effect in the historical record, in this observational data. We can look at the world and all the threats that have been made and try and assess their success rates. But at the end of the day, we're only looking at the threats that have been made. And so we're looking at disputes that have been unable to be solved with means short of coercion. So we're already looking at threats that have been made against more resolved targets. Maybe that's the reason why you see a lot of resistance. The second big bucket of explanations for why coercion fails point to some flaw in the coercer's strategy, a flaw in the coercer's threats, either their credibility or their severity. And so threats have to be believed. You have to know that I'm not bluffing. And so there are lots of strategies political scientists come up with to signal, try and tie your hands and sink costs, right? To try and make the target believe that I, in fact, am serious and I will carry out the threats, the punishments that I am threatening to impose on you. The severity is about pain, right? The threat has to hurt. Sanctions that don't hurt will not change behavior. And so we worry about things like building multilateral coalitions to choke off strategic substitution and making sure that the targets who are supposed to be experiencing this pain and changing their behavior realize that it's a severe consequence. So when you don't make the right threats, they don't work. That's basically what our literature says. And these arguments are so consistent that I think we have somewhat of a paradigm of thought about coercion. Coercion is about threat making, and studying threat making is important to understanding the success of coercion. Policymakers express these intuitions all the time. You go to Washington, right? You will hear often things like, "If we have to make sure they know we're not bluffing. If only we squeeze the adversary a little bit harder for a little bit longer, then they're going to give in." Right? Success is always right around the corner. And I think a lot of my work is trying to blow that up. I think in this article you read, in the book project, and other projects that I have, to try and shift this threat-centric paradigm about coercive bargaining. There's an imbalance when we study coercion to studying what makes threats work, or their credibility and severity. So I want to flesh out a more satisfactory theory of coercive bargaining. And so I'm going to focus today on the article you read on an underappreciated logic in coercion of contingent action that's at the heart of all coercive interactions. Even highly credible and severe threats fail if they are not perceived as conditional. This is something that Thomas Schelling called coercive assurance. So I'm going to offer some definitions. I'm going to then turn to why coercive assurance has been underappreciated in the study of coercion and in the practice of coercion. I'm going to offer a theory called the assurance dilemma. And then I want to describe the cases and research methods in the book to you before walking you through several examples of how coercers have been confronted with the assurance dilemma and targets of coercion, and how they have tried to struggle to overcome it in coercive bargaining. There's a lot of theory in this talk. Saved a lot of the examples for the second half. So, either bear with me or just hopefully you'll see value in the work of big theory to try and complicate and think about coercion and be explicit about the theories and intuitions we have in our own mind about how threats work. So I gave you a definition of coercion already to say it's a strategy of threat making to change the behavior of a target. I think what I say today can apply to both deterrent and compellent threats. Deterrent threats preserve the status quo, compellent threats aim to change the status quo. That said, I'm scoping my empirics down to compellent threats alone. As we all know, deterrence is difficult to observe. When deterrence succeeds, nothing happens, ideally. But also compellent threats are regarded in the literature as the harder ones to make successful, harder threats to make. And it's harder to change the status quo than it is to preserve it, right? So I think if we find something interesting about how compellence works, then our findings about assurance are more likely to travel outside of it to other domains. That's how I've scoped the empirics. Well, let's think about the basics of coercion for a moment. All coercive interactions have three components, at least. They have to have a looming threatened punishment. That's the consequence that the coercer wants the target to consider. Second, they have to have a demand. There is something that the coercer wants the target to do. Sometimes we call these the stakes of the dispute. What is the threat over? What are the stakes of the dispute between coercer and target? And the third necessary component in coercion is a coercive assurance. It's communicating that the punishment will not be carried out if the demands are met. So coercive assurance is just a contingency principle. If you comply, I will not punish you. It underscores that the object of coercion is to present a choice, one that does not lead the target to, the title of the article says, feel like they're damned if they do or damned if they don't. Coercive assurance happens only in the context of coercion. So if you're a political scientist in the room thinking about our literature, I'll digress for just a second to say this is in the tradition of thinking about reassurance. A lot of work that came out during the Cold War. Think about how do you mitigate the security dilemma? Like LeBeau, Stein, or Charles Osgood, people who were thinking about how to mitigate the security dilemma in international politics and make it so that I do not appear threatening to you, right? I am not a threat to you. I mean you no harm. In the context of coercion, I am threatening you today, and I need you to believe that I mean it. The coercive assurance principle comes in trying to make you believe that that is a contingent threat. So it's in the tradition of our reassurance literature, but really quite narrowly scoped to coercive interactions. Coercive assurance is distinct from carrots. Sometimes you hear people talk about this, right? They're like, you need carrots and sticks. That is true. That's a kind of a different literature to think about positive inducements. Carrots are incentives, positive inducements. A coercive assurance doesn't have to be an inducement. It's just the contingency of the stick, right? It's neither stick nor carrot. And other things that you should know, what does this illuminate for us thinking this way about coercive assurance? It doesn't have to be explicit to exist. So this is paraphrasing Tom Schelling's statement of it. To say stop or I'll shoot implies that if you comply, I won't shoot. But these are different statements. Just because you believe the former doesn't mean you're going to believe the latter. They can be judged separately in their credibility by the target. But purely by saying the first one, stop or I'll shoot, I have implied the second one. It exists. It's just a question of whether I want to do anything to improve its credibility or not. Okay? So we don't have to only study explicit assurances that say things like, if you comply, I won't shoot. And of course, that's what we see when we go to, to the historical record. Leaders are usually doing far more to improve the credibility of their threats than they are their implied assurances. Just to get a sense of this, and again, this is just looking at explicitness. But I did a little project with some terrific RAs at Brown. We went back and looked at all the US national security strategy documents from Reagan to Biden. If you're not familiar, this is like a congressionally mandated statement that every presidential administration is supposed to make about what the national security objectives of the United States are and how it intends to go out and achieve those objectives. They're very public-facing kind of bureaucratic documents. But you could think about these as sort of the basket of signals in international politics that a president wants to make to the world in public to allies and adversaries. And of course, when you count them, you see that there are 13 times more threats on average in these documents than there are coercive assurances. So threats are in blue, and the coercive assurances are in red. I add the gray here, not to confuse you, but to really try and scope this one out. There are 9 times more reassurances to allies in these documents than there are coercive assurances to someone who's the target of a threat. When I use the word assurance in Washington, D.C., a lot of people just think that I mean pledge to come to the defense of an ally. That is not what we are talking about. But you'll not be surprised to learn that there are far more of those types of signals as well in national security strategies than there are of explicit logics of this contingency principle of coercive assurance. Okay, look, so maybe you've read Arms and Influence. Thomas Schelling already said this. Maybe that's not such a contribution to not exactly a new thing to write. I think that our field needs a reminder of it. I know that policymakers need a reminder of it all the time, but I do agree with you, right? You need to say something a little more novel about coercive assurances than just they exist. So I want to do two things with my work. Try and study why coercive assurance has been so underappreciated in our scholarship, and why leaders fail to do it if it's a logical thing to do. If it's going to get you what you want, why don't they do it? So let's go there next. The first big reason that assurance has been understudied by scholars, I think, is that we have an assumption in our literature that is sometimes wrong. We believe that punishing capriciously is supposed to be irrational. You're not supposed to do this. This is our traditional model, I'm going to walk you through it, of coercion. It's all driven by the threats of the coercer. It starts with the coercer seeing something in international politics and saying, hey, I don't like that. Is this thing worth issuing a threat over? And if it decides, then we are engaged in a coercive interaction. So if it decides to make a threat, we end up here. The next move is up to the target. It can either decide to defy the threat or concede the stake. If it concedes, we get peace, nothing happens. If it defies, the coercer gets to decide again whether to carry out its threat, do what it said, or to not carry out its threat, in which case it was bluffing. Bluff category. And so we have lots of literature trying to figure out how the way that coercers get targets to go from here to here is by making them believe that we are not bluffing. Okay. If you go from here to here, then I got what I wanted. Threats are costly to carry out. Even just an airstrike costs money and puts lives at risk. Okay. This is costly to do. If I got what I wanted, I should not need to pay any costs. The tree should end. So if you are a political scientist, your ear should be ringing here for kind of general exams, Jim Furon stuff, right? This is an assumption that comes from the rationalist explanations for war literature, bargaining model of war. War is costly for all involved. Coercers then, when this assumption carries over to coercion, should not just carry out punishments willy-nilly. It's costly for them as well. I think that's wrong, as you'll see. I'll say more about it. Another reason, though, we focused on threats in our literature, and this is near and dear to me, as you heard that I'm a professor of nuclear security and policy, in addition to just thinking about international relations theory. But nuclear weapons really narrowed the way we think about coercion. And the reason is that, when Schelling was writing in the Cold War, we were really worried about the big threat that the United States especially was making, to use nuclear weapons. And why were we worried about it? Because it was threatening to do something that a lot of people thought was in fact a bluff. Would the United States really be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend the sovereignty of France? Is it willing to trade Boston for Bonn in a nuclear war? Today, is the United States willing to trade Seattle for Seoul? Are we seriously saying that that foreign capital is as important to our government as a city in the United States? That's a fundamentally difficult threat to make credible. And so we tied ourselves in knots trying to come up with strategies to signal that this is not a bluff, to tie our hands, make it so that we would engineer credibility to a threat that we thought was inherently incredible, to prevent that bluff from being called. And that led to ignoring the other side of the coin. Okay, a little more political science here, but we do factor the prospect of future punishment into our rational analyses of coercion as the study of something called commitment problems. I think coercive assurance is a type of commitment problem in the sense that the commitment problems arise from the fact that the future is not the present and things can change. And political economists call them time inconsistency problems. Well, of course, time is inconsistent. Time moves on and people can change their minds. And so, yes, coercive assurance is a sort of a commitment problem. But traditionally, our literature on commitment problems thinks about the future as something changing between the nature of the relationship between, in this case, the coercer and the target. So, and there's two big things. One is relative power. If I go through this chain, and as a result of the target's concession, the target has gotten weaker, or the coercer has gotten stronger, then we are more likely to go back and start the chain all over again. So commitment problems say, look, you go through this chain, it ends here, right, or here. And at any point in the future, the coercer can decide to come back and demand more stuff, and issue new threats. But they go to example here of relative powers, things like Hitler's Germany gets Czechoslovakia in 1938 to surrender the Sudetenland disputed border regions. Czechoslovakia gives it over, it concedes to Germany's threat, right? But what happens is that that border region was the physical location of Czechoslovakian border defenses. And so in the future, Czechoslovakia, as a result of its concession, has gotten weaker relative to the coercer. And what happens, of course, Hitler's Germany comes back and annexes the rest of Czechoslovakia that has an even less of a capacity to resist in the future than it did in the prior interaction. So something changes about the relationship between the coercer and the target in that commitment problem. The other way we think about this is through reputation, that maybe the target in conceding acquires a reputation for being a pushover. And we know that, this is Texter's work, that like Finland decided to fight what it thought was a doomed war against Russia in 1939, precisely because of this reason. They didn't want to get a reputation for being the one that everyone should come to if you want someone to make concessions to you. I didn't want a reputation for being a pushover. We think that Russia is just more likely to come back and ask for more in the future. So let's not make any concessions, and we'll be willing to fight an extremely costly war. So reputational changes. Assurance commitment problems are a little bit different because they capture more immediate concerns. They're not second order consequences of conceding. They're direct fears of implicitous and unconditional punishment. They obviously add this crucial, bottom right corner that when you concede, when the target concedes, the coercer gets to decide again. Am I gonna carry out the threat, or am I actually going to withhold that threat that I made in the beginning of the chart? And they sound like this. Coercive assurance fears sound like this. In the 1990s, Iraq was under a very heavy multilateral sanctions campaign that crippled the Iraqi economy. The Iraqi people suffered dearly. And the aim of this coercion applied against Iraq was to coerce compliance with UN weapons inspectors who were roving around the countryside asking for admittance to various facilities to ensure the dismantlement of Iraqi chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons facilities, right, that had been discovered after the first Gulf War. And in the context of this very severe, intense coercive sanctions campaign, we now have these records. Saddam was a sort of Nixonian-like figure who recorded a lot of his conversations in the 90s with his advisors. And when American forces invaded in 2003, they brought a lot of these records home with them. So there's an archive of this stuff. But in the midst of that coercive campaign, we can see Saddam saying to his advisors, we can have sanctions with inspectors, that's the WMD inspectors. We can have sanctions with inspectors, sanctions without inspectors. There is no escape from sanctions. Why should I comply? And what does he do? He stops cooperating with the weapons inspector. Right? He defies the threats, the coercive demands. Okay, so if credible assurance is not just implied, I wanted to know, why do targets of coercion fear this non-contingent punishment? When and why do coercers anyway? And the answers to those questions tell us something useful about the relationship between threats and assurances in coercion. And I argue in this article called The Assurance Dilemma that the actions coercers can take to bolster the credibility of their threats, undermine the credibility of their coercive assurances, whether they're implied or not, or explicit. And that this trade-off exists because in the process of bringing pressure to bear on their targets, coercers introduce incentives to punish them anyway. And even if they don't intend it, they can lose control over the application of that punishment. In turn, targets are looking for assuring signals that their coercers remain in control and can withhold punishment and are willing to. And they take risks to concede. It's a probabilistic calculation to say, what are the chances that I'm going to be punished anyways if I concede? What are the chances that I avoid punishment? And they do not want to take that bet if they think it's a bad bet. So in the book, I looked to cases of coercive bargaining over nuclear weapons programs to test the theoretical implications of that kind of general theory statement. On at least 21 occasions, governments have chosen to make threats of sanctions or military force to enforce the non-proliferation regime. Often this comes through as coercive demands of like, please either sign the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or cooperate with IAEA inspectors who are attempting to ensure that you are in compliance with your safeguards obligations under the NPT. But the nuclear facilities you have in your territory are either declared under inspection and used for peaceful purposes only. That's the non-proliferation regime in short, right? To prevent the spread of nuclear weapons technology. You can see all the cases here. It is, of course, mostly the United States, but not only. And the chapters delve into 4 cases in particular in South Africa, Iraq, Libya, and Iran, and try and exploit within case variation to explain not only the occurrence, whether there is a coercive bargain made, but also the timing of that non-proliferation bargain and its timing relative to threat and assurance credibility. Credibility, just to say a word on it, credibility is measured in the eye of the beholder. The coercer doesn't just get to decide whether its threats are credible or not. The target decides. It's an evaluation made by leaders in a target country about whether they expect the coercer to do what it says it's going to do. Studying that, I think, really actually just requires going to the archives. Gotta get into the target state's evaluation, process trace its perception of perceptions of target state officials of the coercer signals. So, and doing that is difficult. I will fully admit there are many target perceptions I wish I had that I don't think I can with confidence judge. But I use archival documents from South African apartheid era government. Those recordings I was talking about of high-level meetings with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Another very useful source is the archives of the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is a neutral international institution. It is not itself engaged in coercing countries to comply with their safeguards obligations. On the other hand, other governments who are members of the IAEA make threats all the time to get you to comply with the IAEA. So to comply and to cooperate with the IAEA is often to give in to the coercive demands that have been posed by someone other than the institution itself, but the institution is an interlocutor essentially between the two. And I supplement all this with writings of target state policymakers, military officials, anything we can get, nuclear scientists. And I conducted some interviews in the more recent cases with officials who participated in coercive bargaining. Just to say a bit more about within case variation for maybe the political scientists or budding political scientists in the room. At a moment when a target's leadership sits down to debate what to do about the pressure that's put on it in response to compellence, I want to code to try and observe their perceptions of the credibility of both threat and assurance. If concessions come after the perception of a credible threat or a severe threat, then coercive assurance would be found to be less necessary component of successful coercion. But if target perceptions of severe and credible threats not lead to successful coercion, it suggests that something's missing from the formula. And we would want to know what explained the timing of an eventual bargain. This is just a hypothetical example of the timing. These things don't have to come in this order, but at some point, the decision tree we were talking about starts because the threat is made against the target. And then they start to evaluate over the years, oh, okay, the sanctions let's say that have been imposed are quite painful. We want to get rid of them. Or they might say for a long time, no, we think they're bluffing, and then change their minds at some point and say, oh, maybe they're not bluffing anymore. And then at some point they might say, either positive or negative, I do not believe in the contingency of this threat. Or maybe they're right. Maybe the things have changed now in such a way, and I want to understand how they've changed, that we think there's a sufficient probability that we can avoid punishment and comply here. So if that's the timing of the concession, right, then we would more affirm the theories of the importance of coercion. Okay, but so for the rest of today, I just want to walk you through examples of how the assurance dilemma rears its head in these cases, and how coercers have struggled sometimes successfully to overcome it. I'm going to do this in 4 categories. I'll talk about the benefits of being insincere. Then I'll get into coalition politics. Then what happens when multiple issues become entangled, and finally the role of information about the stakes. That's something that I call shared knowledge. These terms don't have to mean anything to you right now. They can be jargon. I'm going to explain what they mean. All right, first, when states make threats, there are benefits that we tend to underappreciate to those states actually carrying them out. And I want to highlight 3 of them. It is sometimes worthwhile for an adversary who has chosen to use brute force to disguise its intentions to use brute force in the trappings of coercion. You can think about the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It's a very recent example. 150,000 mobilized Russian troops on the border. People are debating in public, what does this mean? Is Russia demonstrating resolve? Is it sinking costs to show that it really cares? Or is this actually just an imminent invasion? Right? And it's really hard to tell until you get news stories about the amount of blood bags they have brought to the front in anticipation of imminent violence, right? So you're looking for very specific kind of nitty-gritty details. In the absence of those, it's kind of hard to tell whether someone is actually planning an invasion versus engaged in military mobilization to try and coerce. And they will often tell you that they are trying to coerce before they decide to engage in violence. Coercive diplomacy can also deflect blame in the international system for ensuing violence. It can make violence try and appear more justified because it was a last resort. We tried coercion first and they didn't comply, so we had to go to war. After 9/11, this is exactly what George Bush did. George W. Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban government in Afghanistan. It said, hand over Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda terrorists, or, quote, share in their fate. Of course, as he said that, the United States was engaged in the logistical operations to begin the invasion of Afghanistan. There was never a world in which the United States was not going to war in Afghanistan. And Bush admitted this much in his memoir later. He said that, why did I issue the ultimatum? He said his reasoning was to, quote, expose the Taliban, defiance to the world to firm up our justification for a military strike. Okay. This looks like coercion, but it is non-contingent threats. Just third, the last one to highlight is that coercers can see a benefit to carrying out their threats when the audiences that they're concerned about are not in the target country, but in a third party. I want future adversaries who are observing today's interaction to know that adversaries do not go unpunished. And Henry Kissinger made an argument just like this in the 1975 crisis over the seizure of an American vessel, the SS Maya Gez. It was seized by Cambodia. And after securing the release of the 40 hostages, you could read in the NSC meeting minutes that Kissinger said he advocated for airstrikes against the hostage takers. It is essential in situations of this kind to make clear that it is we who define the hazards, and we should not give the impression that we will stop. And there was value in bolstering the reputation of the United States, or what have you, retribution or punishment of those who take hostages of American citizens, not because of what Cambodia is doing today, but because of others who are watching us and watching how we handle this. Okay, so there are reasons why targets of threats are rational to fear that non-contingent punishments might be applied. But other impediments to credible coercive assurance, I think, are less intended by coercers and come out as a result of the ways in which they have tried to build leverage over their targets. Let's go next to coalition politics, which is a big part of this. Coercers build coalitions. They have incentives to build coalitions domestically or internationally to augment the credibility and severity of their threats. There's lots of literature in political science to explain why this is valuable, to demonstrate unified resolve, right? It's not just me, everybody's against you. Or to increase the severity of your punishments, right? So American sanctions might matter this much, but if I can get the Chinese and Russians to cooperate with these sanctions as well, well, then really we can choke off trade to, Iran, for example. And in constructing those coalitions, coercers can lose control of their ability to withhold punishment on their terms. Other people in the coalition get a say. Every actor in the coalition has their own capabilities, their influence, and interests in international politics. And targets, we can see, asking questions like, if I strike a bargain with you, how do I know that they're not going to punish me anyway? Right, so we have a coordination problem among members of the coalition. These kinds of impediments, as I alluded to, came up a lot during coercive bargaining with Iran that led to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is the case I highlighted in the article, specifically about 2015. The book has many other years of dealing with Iran. This is really an ongoing nuclear crisis that began really in 2002. But specifically 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which Donald Trump withdrew from 3 years later. It's pretty amazing that it came together at all in 2015. And I studied a lot about how and why it did. Domestically, during negotiations with Iran, in the United States, Congress was a potential impediment to sanctions relief. You may recall, if you were politically conscious at this time, that in fact, Congress inserted itself into negotiations in a way that the White House was livid about. 47 Republican senators signed a public letter to the Iranian leadership during these, while these diplomatic negotiations were happening, warning them that they might not go along with an agreement that the White House struck with Iran. So concurrent with its formal negotiations with Iran abroad, the White House negotiated with a Republican-controlled Congress to bound congressional oversight over sanctions relief. The result was something called INARA, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, and it was passed 2 months, importantly, to the day before Iran agreed to the deal. This is something that had to be solved before Iran would agree. And it formalized the White House's position that any deal would be considered an executive agreement, not a treaty. It doesn't require ratification in the Senate. And that the president would be free to waive by executive order many nuclear-related sanctions. To not require then a new act of Congress to undo sanctions on the Iranian government. This was an action to demonstrate control over the ability to withhold punishment that a potential spoiler wished to impose. And the same sort of thing was happening internationally. The United States tried to communicate that Israel, state that was not officially party to the bargaining process, would nonetheless be bound by an agreement and not conduct its own unilateral airstrikes, which it was in fact threatening to do. Lots of ways that the US government tried to curtail the actions of Israel. It did a lot of in-country lobbying, fascinatingly, intentionally, officials will tell you, sending high-level dignitaries to be on the ground lobbying in person in Israel at moments when they thought it was most likely that the Israelis were going to strike, thinking that it would be difficult for the Israeli government to strike while an American dignitary was there in Israel in harm's way if there were to be Iranian retaliation. So physical presence did matter. There was also bribery attempted, generous military assistance, a 25% increase in the dollar amount of military aid provided to Israel. But in that military assistance, withholding 2 critical military assets that were crucial to pulling off a campaign to destroy from the air Iranian nuclear facilities. One is tankers, which is flying gas stations to refuel jets that cannot range that distance and would have to refuel in the air in order to reach that far into Iran. Israel didn't have enough tankers. They wanted them. The United States didn't provide it. The other one is earth-penetrating munitions. The United States created a new type of weapon, a 30,000-pound bomb that was intended to destroy facilities like the Natanz enrichment plant or the Fordow enrichment plant that are either under reinforced concrete or in a mountain. And Israel did not have these munitions, wanted, of course, to be provided to them, and the United States did not provide it. critically, right, as this bargaining with Israel is ongoing, the United States government recognizes that the receiver of these signals that's important is not as much Israel as it is Iran. It doesn't so much matter that you've controlled the Israelis if the Iranians don't believe it. So what do? They publicize a lot of this. And the Israelis weren't too happy about that. I interviewed an Israeli national security advisor that told me that Israel and Washington could have kept our consultation secret, but the US decided not to do so. Maybe they did it in order to hug Israel publicly so that they could claim Israel was part of the deal. And of course, when you interview them, he was in particular quick to say that Israel was not part of the deal. They did not approve of the bargain. Israel, however, did not conduct unilateral airstrikes to spoil the bargain. Okay, a third big but related issue is entangling multiple demands. In constructing these coalitions, coercers log roll and expand their aims to tie multiple demands to the same threatened punishments. And in this way, coercion becomes what I call entangled. When targets consider conceding to one demand, they assess that they're going to have to bear the pain of the threatened punishments anyways over another issue which they have not conceded. And so an example of this was in coercive bargaining with South Africa, where in the late 1970s, South Africa had a nuclear program, nuclear weapons interests, but it had not yet constructed a nuclear device, not manufactured a nuclear bomb. But there was pressure imposed on the apartheid government over two issues. One was curtailing its nuclear ambitions, and the other was over its human rights abuses of the apartheid state. And racist South African policymakers in the 1970s were thinking exactly this way about the connection between the two issues. They wanted the removal of nuclear-related sanctions. They perceived an entanglement that encouraged them to double down on both issues, on apartheid and the nuclear weapons program. So the future head of Pretoria's intelligence services concluded at the time that the acquisition of nuclear weapons will not necessarily isolate South Africa any further. And in the words of their chief nuclear scientist, if I have to take the punishment, I at least want to be guilty. What happens immediately after they sit down to make these judgments in the late 70s, they decide to build a nuclear bomb. They take the final step and Pretoria gets a nuclear arsenal. They perceive no coercive assurance. Instead, coercion benefits from the disentangling of issues by keeping discrete demands tied to different punishments. Consider, for example, in the 1990s, confronting Libya over two issues. Lockerbie bombing, which should be in the category of just terrorism, right? But Libya was behind the Lockerbie bombing in Scotland that killed a lot of Americans. And WMD proliferation is the other issue that the United States and the UN are trying to pressure Libya over. The breakthrough comes when the signal sent to Libya that UN sanctions can apply to the Lockerbie issue alone, and American sanctions are going to remain tied to the WMD issue. So you can concede and get some benefit of concession by the removal of UN sanctions if you hand over the planners of the Lockerbie attack. They do. And you unlock this, for the political scientists in the room, the Axelrodian kind of evolution of cooperation possibility of building agreement upon agreement in smaller pieces. If it takes one big agreement, grand bargain to do everything, it's going to be a lot harder to get there. Okay, finally, this is the last category, something I called shared knowledge, but it's a pathway to losing control that's internal to a single coercer. And think about it this way. It is tempting to think of coercive assurance as a problem in political science jargon of what we call private information. That is to say, I issue a threat. I don't intend to punish you anyway. I know that my coercive assurance is credible. It's a problem of private information, though, because I have reasons to, you have reasons to think that I'm lying, and therefore I have to engage in the type of signal to try and communicate to you that, no, I in fact am credible, right? I am trying to communicate that which only I know privately. I'm trying to do so credibly. The problem is thinking about coercive assurance that way is that sometimes coercers cannot know their own future preferences. I actually don't know. I could tell you, but I might be wrong because I might learn things from your concession about who the target is, what they are capable of, and whether my demands were appropriately calibrated in the first place. And targets are going to defy if they think that in conceding, they're only making it more likely that their coercers are going to punish them anyway. So it is important for coercers to know what they're asking for. I call this shared knowledge. Targets want to know that their concessions are not going to reveal new material information to coercers. So Saddam Hussein, we know, was worried about this throughout the 1990s. There's a great article by Malford Brout-Heckhammer. It's called The Cheater's Dilemma, where they're saying, look, if we admit to the biological weapons, we're going to be admitting to them that we had a biological weapons program, and then they're going to just use that to justify an invasion of Iraq. Right? So let's admit everything that they know already, and then hide all the other stuff that we think they don't know. Gaddafi did the same thing. He didn't want to admit having a nuclear weapons program until he was physically confronted with intelligence shared by the United States about how much we already knew about Libya's procurement. And in the article, I compare inspections reports from the IAEA to documents stolen by the Israeli government from Iran in the so-called Atomic Archive to establish that the United States and its partners knew everything that Iran had to admit. They consciously did not push Iran to reveal more than they already knew about its past nuclear weapons program. At the time, Secretary of State John Kerry described it this way: we know what they did, we have no doubt. We have absolute knowledge with respect to the certain military activities they were engaged in, and what we're concerned about is going forward. Another official who was the National Security Advisor, vice president, is now the president's National Security Advisor, described the strategy this way: we knew, and they knew that we knew, and we knew that they knew we knew. I just love the way he articulated that. So overall, I'm trying to put some bones on this axiomatic importance of assurance and coercion. If you think it's just logical, then that's fine, great. We've already got you in the coercive assurance camp, but we should study it to understand its dynamics, how it varies, right? And when it's the context in which it can vary. I think we need to take this more seriously. Coercive assurance is difficult even for sincere coercers because it's a dilemma between making credible threats and credibly assuring. And as you bolster your threats, you can lose control over their application. I think there's a lot more work for us to do in the field of political science about this. It has already begun. I'm not going to go into all of these, but there is a sort of, in the last few years, burgeoning interest in this topic. We ought to know, right? When positioning an aircraft carrier off the coast communicates more of an intent to punish than to not. Implications, finally, an implication for policy. The implication for scholarship is basically that we have to study this a lot more and understand its, and go beyond the threat paradigm. Implications for policy are that this can matter a great deal in international politics because coercion is so prevalent, and when it doesn't work, you can see wars. A failure can lead to war. So leaders should not just try and bully their way to influence. And when leaders elect to coerce, they should do so sincerely by being willing to let their targets avoid punishment. The book is full of examples of leaders making illogical threats from the perspective of coercive assurance. I want to highlight another one here, demonstrate it's a bipartisan problem. President Obama gave a speech in 2014 about the Islamic State. And it was after the terrorist attack in Paris in 2014. And he said in this speech, we're sending a message. If you target Americans, you will have no safe haven. As he said this, the US military was already engaged in a military campaign to degrade and destroy the Islamic State. In fact, sentences earlier, he had said that special operations forces are hard at work, quote, hitting ISIL harder than ever in Syria and Iraq and taking out their leaders. So the threat he was trying to use as a deterrent threat to not harm Americans was in fact already being carried out. And we should not expect it to have had deterrent value. The answer doesn't have to be that you should try coercion and that when you coerce, you have to assure. It is possible that sometimes, as in the case of the Islamic State, that brute force was a good policy. The problem is when it comes in the trappings of coercion. We like to put it in the trappings of the coercion. And leaders don't seem to appreciate enough that the ability to assure is power, just as the ability to threaten is power. And so a state that cannot make credible contingent threats is a weaker state. no matter how much it can threaten in international politics. I think this has implications for how we understand power in the international system as well. Really look forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me back at Cornell.